We refer to that as our Zoom collect. So here comes Bonnie. Bonnie is connecting. There's Bonnie. Hi, Bonnie.
How are you?
Good. Welcome. Welcome.
Thank you.
Well, Michelle, most everybody here is involved in parish ministry in one way, form, or another. So I think there were a lot of people that came to me that said, "Oh, that's a really important topic, and I wish I could be there." So we're looking very much forward to what you have to tell us. Michelle is not a stranger to the Presbytery of Utica, so you've been involved in any one of a number of congregations here, and even at the presbytery level. So it's always a joy to be with you.
Same with you. So just 10 seconds worth. This is all Presbytery of Utica, folks.
Correct.
Okay. And this is a weekly thing you do that just gets everybody together to talk about any number of anythings.
Correct.
Okay. And how did you, what did you say this was to the people that you said it to?
We just call it our weekly pastors and worship leaders gathering. So.
I mean, what I was going to talk about today.
Oh, Soul Shop. I told him you were going to talk about Soul Shop.
Got it. Okay. Super. Are the people here pastors?
Right.
Okay. Michael is, Scott is, Bonnie is, Gail. You're muted. You're still muted.
Well, actually, Michelle, we're sort of pastor-like. Some of us are like, have different titles.
Like CREs and.
Yeah, but we're all involved as worship leaders. How about that?
Perfect. Okay, got it. Good. So does this go for an hour? 40 minutes.
30 minutes. 30
40 minutes.
30, 40 minutes.
30 minutes. Okay, great. So my name's Michelle. Good to meet you all. I live in Pittsburgh. I'm a ruling elder. I'm a ruling elder in Pittsburgh Presbytery, married to a teaching elder in Pittsburgh Presbytery. Met my husband in seminary. I have a master's in divinity and a master's in social work. So I'm one of those people, those dual degree folks who bring sort of a theological lens and a mental health lens. And to give you sort of the abbreviated version of how I ended up where I ended up, my colleague, his name is Russ Crabtree, and he developed the Holy Cow assessment. So we ran it through the presbytery, and I've run it in some of the churches in your presbytery. He owned Holy Cow Consulting, he ran Holy Cow Consulting, but another part of his story, another part of his narrative is that back in the 90s, he was the pastor of a large church in a small town. So that's a very particular role to be in a large church in a small town. And in that large church in a small town, in one academic year, there were 3 of the students who died by suicide. So there was a youth suicide in October, in November, and in April. And Russ said, I looked like I realized somebody needs to do something about this. Somebody needs to be responding to this in some meaningful way. So he got trained in suicide prevention and started doing trainings, just sort of trainings all over Southern Ohio. And he said, I would go into small town after small town, and I'd get 100 people to come into a fire hall or a high school gymnasium or, fire hall to talk about suicide. And there'd be healthcare people and education people and first responders and grandparents, and you name it, we had it in the room, except for pastors. He said, I'd look around and there wouldn't be a pastor in the room, or maybe we'd have one pastor in the room. And I started asking, what is it about the way we're having this conversation that isn't capturing the theological imagination of the church? And how do we think differently about this conversation of suicide? There's a suicidologist who says that people die by suicide for all kinds of reasons, but it basically comes down to 2. It's a loss of hope and a loss of social connection. And if the Church of Jesus Christ can't do something about those two things, then we should probably just close our doors. That was his quote, this secular suicidologist. I mean, he was a person of faith, but he was a medical doctor. Um, and so in some ways that was what Russ was saying, like hope and social connection. If those are really the root causes of suicide, then that's got an awful lot to do with what we do. It's just that we don't realize how much it's got to do with what we do.
Mhm.
So, I had a suicide researcher tell me once that suicide happens when distress overpowers resilience. And I love that sentiment, because what it does is decouple suicide from depression. I think very, very often what we hear people say when a person dies by suicide is, I didn't even realize that person was depressed. And the data just doesn't line up with that. It doesn't line up with it at all. Some data shows that 60% of people who die by suicide were depressed. Some data shows that it's as low as 40% of people, but not almost everyone who's dying by suicide is depressed. Well, what is true about suicide is that people who are dying by it are experiencing despair, not depression. And in the church, we get into our heads that this is an issue of depression. Depression is a mental health issue. This needs to be offloaded to the mental health community. It needs to be referred out to the mental health community. It needs, referral. And we're ending up pushing people off who are in desperate need of hope, which we are supposed to be pretty good at, and community, which we are supposed to be pretty good at, and putting them into a mental health system that's designed to pathologize them. And so just some suicide data is that people, number one, high suicide rates in America are 45 to 65-year-old white men. They make up 70% of suicides in America. Some of the highest suicide rates by vocation are construction workers and farmers. We lose 22 veterans to suicide every single day. White women's suicide rates peak around age 50 when they hit the kind of the climax of empty nest and menopause. And so you've got these people who are dealing with these life situations, these issues of despair, these issues of, does the world still need me? These issues of stress. In Soul Shop, actually, we have come up with what we call the 6 S's of suicide. And we name those 6 S's, like what are the contributaries to suicide? To be sickness, shame, stress, societal and systemic issues like systemic racism, shunning, and then being stuck in a life that's no longer working. So I'll say those again, see somebody's writing. Sickness, shame, stress, societal systemic issues, shunning, and being stuck in a life that's no longer working. And when you look around your congregation, it's sort of a game-changing sort of matrix, because that's very, very different than the mentally ill. That's people who are in domestic violence situations and can't get out. That's people who are people who, I say about stress, like, how stressful is it to live in a world where my entire family's legacy and whole vocation is dependent on whether or not it rains? No wonder farmers have such high suicide rates. Medical doctors have higher suicide rates than veterans. One physician in America dies by suicide every single day, which is per capita higher. Levels of stress, levels of debt, levels of marital problems and woes, divorce. Men who are going through a divorce have suicide rates that are 8 times that of women going through a divorce. So we have all of this data that accumulates that says we've actually got something very different going on here than depression. And the thing that we have going on here are things that the church actually knows how to respond to. And so in Soul Shop, what we do is get in front of faith leaders to frame this as an issue of faith, to frame suicide as an issue of multiple contributaries that overpower a person's resilience. And then we ask the church, what assets do you have right at your fingertips in real time right now that could make a substantial difference in the lives of people who are experiencing despair? The estimates are that 6% of adults and 20% of adolescents are thinking about suicide at any given time. And so we dramatically underestimate how prolific this is in our congregations. And we have something that we can do about it. So that's what we do in Soul Shop. Just for the record, Soul Shop started as, Russ Crabtree's good idea and a PowerPoint slide in a room full of pastors, and people really liked it. He said, well, I'm 66 and I'm not going to take this out into the world. Who do I know who has a master's in divinity and a master's in social work? And is part of a Samaritan counseling network of people who can take this out into the world. You have a Samaritan counseling center in your presbytery, right, Larry? Yeah. So I led a Samaritan counseling center in Pittsburgh, connected to yours up there. And my Samaritan counseling center took it on, and we've taken it national. So we now have done Soul Shop in 39 or 40 states. I think it's 41 by the end of 25. We've done it in 4 countries. We have developed Soul Shop for youth workers, Soul Shop for campus ministry, Soul Shop for Black churches. We're currently writing Soul Shop for Hispanic churches, and in January, we're taking it to Africa. We have 68 trainers across the United States in 25 states, and have really started a movement that I'm not sure quite where it's going to go, but that's what Soul Shop is. Anybody have any questions about suicide or about Soul Shop? Or I can take this conversation 25 different directions. What do you want to talk about?
Well, what happens at a Soul Shop workshop?
Huh?
Tell us what happens at a Soul Shop workshop.
Okay, sure. So the Soul Shop workshop is about 8 hours long, and we start the day by framing the question. So our opening quote is, people lead lives of quiet desperation, right? It's Henry David Thoreau, the great masses of humanity lead lives of quiet desperation. And our question is, why are we all so quiet about it? If the masses are living this way, if we've got 6% of our adults and 20% of our kids who are thinking about suicide, let alone the people who've lost someone, the people who are worried about a loved one, or the people who have been suicidal in the past and never told their story. Like, we're talking about 50% of a congregation. Why are we so quiet? We look at the woman with the hemorrhage who came up and touched the hem of Jesus's garment, and talk about her level of desperation. If suicidality is largely about desperation, we've got a desperate woman here in the Bible. How did Jesus handle it? We've got a desperate person in Job. Let's take a look at Job. Job actually says, suffocation would be better than the pain that I'm in. So we've got a guy who expresses a kind of suicidality. So we kind of frame, like, this is all through our Bible. Like, this is here. We look at the story of the Philippian jailer who thought that all the prisoners got out, and he was about to fall on his sword and kill himself, when the community rallied around him and said, do not harm yourself, for we are all here. We talk about the statistics that some of what I just said to you. So we're kind of setting the stage. Why should faith communities care about this? This is right under our noses. That's why. And then we learn, we teach some basic gatekeeper training kinds of things. What do you look for? What are the indicators of suicide? How do you, oftentimes people say there were no signs, when what they really mean is we didn't know what to look for. So how do we recognize what's right in front of us? How do we ask the question? What are some helpful and appropriate ways to ask the question? I suggest that the 2 best ways that I have found are, sometimes people going through what you're going through start to think about suicide. Are you thinking about suicide? And does it ever get so bad that sometimes you think about suicide? I like them because they're normalizing. I like them because they're not shaming. I like them because if people are feeling isolated in their pain, saying sometimes people going through what you're going through start to experience this. It gives them a sense of community and solidarity with other people like them. Does it ever get so bad that sometimes you think about suicide as a way of acknowledging their pain? You know, people who are thinking about suicide don't want to be dead. They just want to be out of the pain that they're in, and they don't know how to do that other than through death. And so it's a way of saying, I see the pain. Like I'm not trying to check a box to make sure you stay alive so that I don't have liability issues. Like I want to know about how it hurts and what you're going through. Tell me about that. So we talk about that, and then we talk about how you hand people off, a safe handoff. What are the community resources that you can send them to? We talk about the 988 helpline, and what it does and who it's for and how it works and all of that. So we give people some general sense of that. And then we spend the whole afternoon saying, what would it look like if a church were to take this mandate seriously, the mandate to bind up the brokenhearted? How would we go about that as a faith community? And one of the ways is we would preach about it. So then we look at every passage in the Bible that talks about suicide. There are suicides in the Old Testament. There are suicide attempts. Even Elijah sat under a tree and prayed to die. You've got people who are being bullied. You've got Hagar and Sarah. You've got Samson, which was a revenge killing of like the masses. So we just do kind of a biblical walkthrough of what are the different ways and places that you could preach about this. The Gerasene demoniac who was slashing himself with rocks and kind of living with a kind of self-harm. We've got a dad in the Bible whose son keeps throwing him in the fire and the water, and he's begging Jesus for help. We've got all kinds of stories. Saul, the first king of Israel, died by suicide. So we walk through each of those stories and kind of think about what would it look like to preach about this. We write a prayer together where we pray for people who are thinking about suicide. And we write the prayer that could be used liturgically, and then we pray them together in community. We look at the successes of suicide and we brainstorm how could faith communities respond? Like if domestic violence, what is it? 25% of women who die by suicide were involved in domestic violence at the time of their death. How many empty nesters in our churches have some spare bedrooms that they could put a young girl up? How many small business owners do we have in our churches that could give somebody recently released from incarceration a chance at meaningful vocation? How many sandwich generation people do we have who are exhausted because they're caring on both sides that could use some respite if you just went and sat with an elderly parent? There are so many places that we could be making use of our people and our resources for the sake of providing community and hope for those among us. And so instead of the church seeing itself as a pathway to mental health treatment or a sort of a pass-through for this problem, Soul Shop encourages congregations to think about how it can not just kind of recognize the problem and hand it off, but be part of the solution. So that's what happens in a Soul Shop day.
Do you work with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention?
We sure do. What do you know about AFSP?
Well, I know all about it. I'm an expert after sitting in on an hour. The reason I bring it up is being facetious, of course. We have in Clinton, village of Clinton here, we have a ministerium group of different pastors from different churches. And so we just hosted a suicide Talk Saves Lives seminar last Wednesday that was hosted by St. James Episcopal Church, but Mary Beth Green, who's a retired social worker with AFSP, also with the National Alliance on Mental Health for Herkimer and Oneida counties, and she's from Herkimer County, and she came and gave a formal presentation that they have, and we had a discussion about that, as well as they have online items as well. Mother Joanna Benskin at St. James had taken. There's an 8-hour course I think she took for pastors. That's, free online for that. And then there's another one that's more like a 2-hour one, more for kind of like lay people and such. And so we just had a ministerial meeting an hour ago, 2 hours ago, trying to talk a little bit about, so what would be next steps. It was the beginning of a conversation. We didn't want it to be a one and done. And what would be the next thing to do, anyway, that's where we are. So
Yep.
just very coincidental that we're having this discussion literally days after we were just having amongst ourselves the same kind of a discussion to say, hey, this is an issue. What can we do about it? And first thing being, let's learn more about it, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me fill in some of those spaces. Yes, we work with AFSP, at American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Soul Shop is the only approved provider of faith-based suicide prevention training through the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. They also paid to fund Soul Shop for Black churches. So we co-collaborated on Soul Shop for Black churches. So we're deep in bed with them. The co-owner of Soul Shop, who is not with us today, was on their national board for a while, chaired the Arkansas chapter. I know your area director, whether it's Missy Stolfi or it's Karen, I can't remember her last name,
Hasek.
Heising. Yep. Okay. So we've done soul shops in both of those regions through AFSP. What you're talking about, the 8-hour faith-based training for pastors that's online, is actually not through AFSP. That's through Living Works. Living Works Faith is what that's called. And your state, the state of New York, bought 1,000 versions of Living Works Faith. They have only used about 100 of them. They don't know how to get them into pastors' hands. If you would like to get those into pastors' hands, you're more than welcome to. It's entirely online. It is 8 hours. So like sort of Living Works, I'm on the phone with them once a week. Soul Shop is the in-person version. Living Works Faith is the online, is basically how it boils down. And so yeah. And if AFSP wanted to host a soul shop in your area, they would be permitted by national, and we would be happy to do that. In fact, we have a trainer who lives in Jamestown, which is just a couple hours from you. She's a Presbyterian pastor, and she would be eager to do it. So I'd be happy to make that connection with is it Karen? Are you in Karen's region?
Yeah, yes, I believe so.
Yeah.
Where I'm in Madison County, so I know she's with us, but I don't know if going east, if that still applies.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So it's a great organization. That community walk money goes to pay for soul shops in communities as one of the things that you can do. So yeah, I'd be happy to talk to your ministerium too, if that would be useful.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's great.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things we do, Living Works Faith, like it is absolutely fantastic for what it is. I'm an extrovert, so I don't like sitting in front of a computer for 8 hours. But I think, if you're in Alaska, if you're in rural Alaska, like it's a phenomenal resource. It's really wonderful. One of the things, and South Carolina, for instance, they bought a bunch of those and then they hosted soul shops. And so you get people thinking about suicide, you get people thinking about how to be part of the solution and all of that. And then get them all in a room together and say, now what could our community response be? Not only how do we as a congregation think communally, but how do we as churches in a community think communally about the responses? So yeah, lots that can be done there.
Michelle, can you talk a little bit about how some smaller congregations, let's say, after they've taken some training, how does it roll out? You've preached about it. You've done the training. What does it look like on the ground organizationally? Can you speak to a couple of examples about that?
What is I can, but what is when you say, how does it
Well,
look?
so you've trained people.
Mhm.
You've been at the pulpit, you've preached about it.
Mhm.
Then what? What happens next?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a web that can go out in 1,000 different directions. One of my colleagues, she's a soul shop trainer in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So very rural, very, kind of isolated communities, small churches. And what she would say to me is, okay, let me put a false ending on that sentence and say something else. One of the things we do in Soul Shop, we talk about the call of God, the call to bind up the brokenhearted. What is our call? It's to ask the question, listen, and lead to safety. But the C in the call model is that we'll make a commitment that if we are ever thinking about suicide, we'll tell someone. And so we walk through, who would you tell? Like, we're going to get our own seatbelts on before we put anybody else's on. We're going to put on our own oxygen mask. We think suicide is right inside of our walls too. 6% of adults, 20% of kids. So let's all not be so naive to believe it couldn't happen to us. Who would we tell? And people write down the names of the 3 people that they would tell. And then we talk about, like, what would it look like if we all in a church had the names of 3 people? How would that play out in the context of our congregation? And the way the conversation goes, and what is true, is that it begins to normalize help seeking. It begins to normalize having hard conversations. Suicide is just a gateway conversation. Suicide is almost never about suicide. Suicide is about mental illness. It's about substance abuse. It's about domestic violence. It's about bankruptcy. It's about job loss. It's about emasculation. It's about, blah, 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 blah. So what I see at the ground, particularly in small and rural communities, is that people start having authentic conversation. And as authentic conversation happens, then needs emerge. And as needs emerge, then the community can respond. So it can be a very kind of gelling. What my colleague would say is, in my church, I'm not seeing people talk near as much about suicide as I am about the impacts of addiction and substance abuse. But the reason they're having those conversations is because we've normalized that the masses are leading lives of quiet desperation. Let's be honest about that. And so I think that it's highly contextual in terms of how that breaks out, but there is a kind of normalizing of the honesty in that way. I mean, that's just one answer, but yeah.
And that's a good one. Yes.
I guess I'm thinking that every person that's on this call right now, I mean, we're talking about this and maybe we're imagining it in the context of people who are in church every Sunday. But the reality is everybody that's on this call has some kind of ministry associated with the church that they represent. Food pantries, clothing, fair trade shop, that touch hundreds, if not thousands of other people in the course of a year. And letting those people know that the church that they've come to for the food pantry is also going to be there for them in these moments that we're talking about.
Yep. I think that's absolutely right.
So I think that sort of is a partial answer to your question, Bonnie. How does it roll out? There ought to be some poster or something in every congregation that says, "Are you thinking about suicide?" How can we touch you in this way? How can we be here for you in this moment?
Yeah.
Because the notion that that number of people is not having those moments is just ludicrous. They're walking right past us.
Yep. Yeah, and I think we're reasonably good in the church here and there now and again. We're reasonably good at extending help. Food pantry being a great example. Our churches do a lot of that. What we're not as good at is saying, like, are you thinking about suicide? You're not alone. Lots of people here have thought about suicide. So part of what we're doing is not just here's where you can get a bed, homeless person, and here's where you can get rehab, drug addict, and here's where you can get food insecure person, but it's teaching a congregation to say, I thought about suicide too, and here's how I lived, and sometimes I have really bad days, and it doesn't, sometimes that's me too. It's not sort of the us them mentality, but it's saying, like, us, like, you are one of us, and we live with this thing. So anyway, yeah, it's almost bottomless. My job is to figure out how to talk about it without overwhelming people, but motivating them instead. But I, we are overwhelmed by this conversation. Part of the reason we don't open this Pandora's box is because we're afraid of what we're going to find inside. I'll end with this one story because I think we're over time a little bit. There's a woman who did a TED Talk, and it's worth looking into. Her name is Barbara Shar, and she did these things called, I call them resource cafes. I don't know what she called them, but what she basically said is that if we pool our resources as a community, we can solve almost any problem. And we tend to think as individuals, what am I going to do for a homeless person? I can't do anything for a homeless person. Like, how can I help? So she tells this story about how she just opened a microphone and have a person come and talk about what's their problem and what's their obstacle, and had all kinds of like interesting stories about what they accomplished. But one of the stories was that a woman got up and said, I'm the sole caregiver for my adult daughter who's disabled, and I'm exhausted and I need a break so bad. And she said, like, just sort of open the mic. Who can help? Who's got any help? There was a guy who came running up in his gym clothes. He was like wearing gym clothes and shaking a piece of paper. And he said, I just ran a marathon this morning and I won a cruise for one to Hawaii. And my wife is never going to let me take a cruise for one to Hawaii. So you might as well take it. This is yours. And she said, well, that's great, but what am I going to do for my daughter? And another person in the room stood up and said, well, I'm a public health nurse and I've got to donate 10 days of free service to keep my license. And I'm almost expired. I didn't know what I was going to do, and I'd be happy to keep your daughter. And the woman said, okay, well, I'm reasonably close to this, so I guess I better tell you the truth. The final thing is that my daughter her disability is that she suffers from crippling anxiety because she's being pursued by a domestic abuser. And I don't feel like I can leave her with that. And Barbara said from the back of the auditorium, she heard this booming voice that said, I'm a cop. What's his name? and so Barbara said, the cop took care of the husband. The woman got to go on her cruise. Her daughter got taken care of. She came home to a whole new community of people that were there for them. And she says, like, it's an example of how there's very little we can't accomplish if we pool our resources. And the thing about the church is that we are a pre-existent network. And so that's part of the brainstorm is what does, like, I can't do anything for a homeless person, but I do have a spare bed in my attic that I'm not using. And somebody else has an empty apartment, and somebody else has a job that they can give them, and somebody else can provide childcare while they go to work. And the four of us can make it happen what one of us can't do alone. And so that's suicide prevention, a la Soul Shop. Okay. Sorry.
So Michelle, it's you label it suicide prevention, and that comes with all of its, it's definitions. But really, as I listen to you, it sounds like getting down to having really honest, soul-bearing sharing of what the real needs are. If you work at the real needs, I'm thinking that the ideation around suicide gradually just fades away. It's not an option as much as it once was.
Yep.
So then it comes down to having people being honest and trusting those around them that they'll be there when they share their soul.
Yep. You're spot on. So one of the things we talk about early in Soul Shop is that our aspiration, that our vision is to create soul-safe communities that which we describe as one that addresses suicidal desperation as a regular aspect of its life and work. And I always say, the thing about this quote I like so, or this definition I like so much, is you could take suicide out and it would still be true. A soul-safe community is one that addresses desperation as a regular aspect of its life and work. And what we're really aspiring for is how we create soul-safe communities where people are willing to look desperation in the eye. That story of the woman with the hemorrhage, it says Jesus turned around and saw her, and she fell down and told him her whole truth. because desperate people really want to tell us their truth. They're just afraid that they're not being seen. So you're absolutely right that that's what we're doing. In some ways, I wish that Soul Shop wasn't about suicide, because it's almost not about suicide. But if I went around the country offering soul safe community workshops, nobody would come because nobody knows what that is. And so suicide is a way to get people into the door to talk to really, I mean, in some ways we're solving the suicide problem plus a whole bunch more. So yeah, you're right.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Good stuff.
Way good stuff.
Yeah. 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 It's like a having a way of being church to one another.
Yeah. Yep. I heard one of my mentors used to say, people are digging around for the will of God like it's a needle in a haystack. And what I want to say to them is, the will of God is the hay and you're laying right in it. Like, this is not as hard as we make it with our flip charts and our markers. Yeah.
Wow. Anybody got another question or comment? Michelle, early on, you talked about writing prayers in Soul Shop.
Yeah.
Do you have one of those prayers you could close us?
Not at my fingertips. But I could probably pretty easily find the benediction that we end every Soul Shop with.
That will suffice.
Yeah, let me see if I can pull that up quickly.
Well, Larry, is this a question to you? Well, Michelle looks that up. Where would any of this work that Michelle's talked about fit into plentiful gifts?
I think it might have a direct correlation
Mm,
by virtue of the fact that the people who have, I want to say it this way, and I don't know if it's correct, but there are people that will have a call around this kind of work. You know,
Yeah.
we sometimes, Michelle, you said you got to look desperation in the eye. And sometimes I think we run down the hallway trying to avoid desperation.
True.
So, and you've asked the question, Bonnie, how do we have the honest conversations? How do we implement those moments of connection that are so necessary for these kind of conversations? And I think it's the people that Plentiful Gifts uncovers that have the giftedness and the call on their lives to do this. I think everybody can play a role, but maybe not everybody's called to really get knee deep in this, waist deep in this. You know, I think I'm just thinking this is an opportunity to start an initiative. I mean, the Presbytery of Utica could probably be instrumental in an initiative, but I think it's a much wider conversation than just the churches of the Presbytery. I think it involves the ministeriums out there. You know, if we're going to do a soul shop here, let's not do it just for the churches of the Presbytery of Utica. Let's get the Methodists and the Episcopalians and the Lutherans and everybody involved.
And the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Yeah.
But we've just sort of started that a little bit with the ecumenical stuff in our neighborhood. You know, I mean, it just seems, I'm way off topic, but it just seems to me that the connections we have just with a few ecumenically and Plentiful Gifts under the CARE initiative, one of the 7, there's a ministry that might blossom right with the right seeds.
Every bit of it. And it doesn't have to be a global initiative. Let's just start with the community. Go from there.
I'm happy to be in any conversation that you want me to show up for.
Well, oh, you will, young Skywalker.
Let me send us out with a benediction.
Please.
May God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, and isolation, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and to turn their pain into joy. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in the world, so that you can do what others claim cannot be done, bringing hope and kindness to all God's children. Amen.
Amen. Thank you,
Thank you.
Michelle.
You're welcome. Good to be with y'all.
Thank you.
You too. Thank you.
The Lord be with you.
And also with
Also
you.
with you.
Bye now.